On the very edge of our village, where the neat little fences gave way to tangled, grasping roots, lived a woman. She was not like the other women. Her house was a crooked thing, all sharp angles and dark wood, with a chimney that puffed out smoke in colors you wouldn't expect. Purple smoke, green smoke. Sometimes on a Tuesday, a smoke the color of a bad bruise. The children of the village were told never to go near that house. Our parents would point with a trembling finger and whisper of the dark powers that lived inside, swirling around her like a cloak. They called her the witch. She had eyes the color of moss after a long rain, and they seemed to see right through you. Not just your skin and bones, but into the wobbly, frightened bits of your soul. She rarely came into the village square. When she did, a hush would fall. Mothers would pull their children close, their hands tightening on small shoulders. The baker would suddenly find his floor needed sweeping. The butcher would vanish into his cold room. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated fear. A fear that she could turn your milk sour with a single glance, or make your prize-winning piglet wither away with a muttered word. The stories they told about her were magnificent and terrifying. They said she danced with shadows when the moon was a sliver in the sky. They said she could brew storms in her cauldron and speak the language of crows. One man swore he saw her turn a rat into a teacup, though he was known for his love of strong cider. But the most frightening stories, the ones that made your blood run cold, were about what she did to little boys. They were just whispers, of course. Dark, nasty little whispers that slithered from person to person like poisonous snakes. These whispers were the reason no boy ever kicked his ball too far towards the woods. It was why no child dared to chase a butterfly past the last friendly gatepost. Her power, they said, was a hungry thing. It fed on the innocence of the young, and it was particularly interested in boys on the cusp of becoming men. The adults spoke of her as a necessary evil, a dark reminder of the wild world that pressed in on their orderly lives. But to a child, she was simply the monster that lived just beyond the edge of everything safe and known. In our village, traditions were as solid as the ancient stones in the church wall. They were not to be questioned. They were simply to be done, just as they had been done by our fathers and their fathers before them. One of these traditions was a special ceremony for boys when they reached a certain age. It was a secret thing, spoken of in low voices between the men. The women would just nod grimly and prepare special foods, their faces tight with a sorrow they never explained. The ceremony was meant to make a boy strong, to make him a man. The whispers said it was a cutting, a sharp, painful moment that was over quickly but left a mark forever. It was called circumcision. The word itself sounded like a secret, something sharp and brittle. The men would say it was a test of courage. They would say it forged a bond between them, a shared memory of pain that made them part of the village's true heart. But the boys who had gone through it never spoke of it. They would just come back quieter, their eyes holding a new, shadowed look. Their boisterous games would be replaced by a solemn watchfulness for a week or two. This tradition was tangled up with the fear of the witch. The elders claimed the ceremony protected the boys from her dark influence. They said the act of cutting, the shedding of blood on village soil, created a shield that her magic could not pierce. It was a strange and frightening logic. To protect the boys from a possible harm, they had to inflict a definite one. The fear of the witch became a tool, a hammer used to nail the tradition firmly in place. "It is for your own good," the fathers would say, their voices rough with a certainty they probably didn't feel. "It keeps the witch away." And so, the fear grew in two directions. There was the fear of the wild, unknown power of the woman in the woods. And then there was the fear of the certain, known pain of the village tradition. For a young boy, the world became a place of looming threats. One was a monster in a story, a creature of shadow and smoke. The other was his own father, his own uncles, the men of his village, their faces grim and determined as they prepared for the day they would make him one of them. It was a terrible choice to have to think about. Young Thomas was 10 years old, and his time was coming. He could feel it in the way his father looked at him, a mixture of pride and something that looked awfully like pity. He heard the whispers growing louder among the women in the market. He saw the village elder, a man with a beard like a bundle of gray wire, sharpening a small, curved knife on a whetstone. The sound of it, a rhythmic shh, scraped along his nerves and made the hairs on his arms stand up. Every boy in the village knew that sound. It was the sound of tradition. It was the sound of pain. The night before the ceremony, Thomas could not sleep. He lay in his small bed, the wool blanket scratching his chin, and stared into the darkness. He thought of the other boys, his friends, who had walked into the elder's hut and come out changed. They tried to be brave, but he had seen them wince when they sat down. He had heard one of them, Leo, crying softly behind the woodshed when he thought no one was listening. The men said it was a moment of honor, but all Thomas could think about was the sharpness of the knife and the hot, searing pain it would bring. He did not want to be brave. He did not want to be a man if this was the price. He wanted to be a boy, to run and climb trees and not have to think about blood and knives and the grim faces of the village elders. A knot of pure, cold terror tightened in his stomach. It was a physical thing, a cold stone of fear that made it hard to breathe. The thought of his own father holding him down while another man hurt him was more terrifying than any story about the witch. At least the witch was a distant threat, a monster you could run from. This monster was waiting for him in his own home. So, in the deep, dark hour just before the dawn, Thomas made a choice. He slipped out of his bed, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. He pulled on his trousers and his thin shirt, his hands trembling so much it was hard to work the buttons. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to go away from the sound of the sharpening stone and the heavy silence of his sleeping father. He crept out of the house, a small shadow swallowed by the bigger shadows of the night, and ran. He ran towards the one place everyone had told him never to go. He ran towards the woods. The forest was a different creature at night. The familiar trees of daylight became towering skeletal giants with arms that clawed at the sky. Every rustle of leaves was a monster. Every snap of a twig was a pursuing footstep. Thomas ran blindly, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the dirt and sweat. He stumbled over roots and scrambled through thorny bushes that tore at his clothes and skin. He was not running to anywhere specific. He was simply running from the village, from the knife, from the ceremony that felt like a betrayal. His lungs burned, and a sharp stitch grew in his side. But the fear behind him was greater than the pain within him. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a heap at the base of an ancient moss-covered oak tree. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind only exhaustion and a profound aching despair. He was lost. He was alone, and he was terrified. He curled into a small ball, hugging his knees to his chest, and finally let out the sobs he had been holding back. They were not quiet, dignified sobs. They were ragged, desperate howls of a child who felt the world had turned against him. The sound echoed through the silent trees, a small, pathetic noise in the vast, dark woods. He cried for a long time, until his throat was raw and his eyes were swollen. He cried for his lost sense of safety, for the father who was supposed to protect him, for the village that demanded a piece of him. As his sobs quieted into hiccuping breaths, he heard a new sound. It was the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was not the heavy, booted tread of the village men. It was lighter, softer. He held his breath, praying it was just a deer or a fox. But it was not. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the faint pre-dawn light. It was a woman. She was tall, wrapped in a dark cloak, and her face was a pale oval in the gloom. Thomas knew instantly who it was: the witch. Every story he had ever heard rushed back into his mind. He scrambled backwards, pressing himself against the rough bark of the tree, too frightened even to scream. The woman stopped a few feet away, her head tilted slightly. She didn't look angry or monstrous. She just looked watchful. And then she spoke, her voice not a cackle, but a low, calm whisper. "That is a lot of sadness for one small boy." The witch did not grab him. She did not chant or cast a spell. She simply stood there, waiting. After a moment, she held out a hand. It was not a gnarled, claw-like hand from the stories, but a normal hand, with long, slender fingers. "You are cold and you are frightened," she said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "My cottage is warm. There is hot tea and bread. No one will find you there." Thomas stared at her hand. He was still terrified, but the woman's calm presence was a strange comfort after the panic of his flight. The village offered him certain pain. This woman, this witch, was offering him tea. He hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. But the thought of the warm cottage, of safety from the elder's knife, was just too tempting. Slowly, shakily, he took her hand. Her skin was cool, not icy, and her grip was gentle. She led him through the woods, navigating the winding paths with an ease that showed she belonged there. They arrived at the crooked cottage. Up close, it looked less menacing and more like a house that had simply grown tired and decided to lean against a tree for support. The purple smoke rising from the chimney smelled strangely of lavender and cinnamon. Inside, it was not the dark, spider-infested lair he had imagined. It was one single large room, cluttered but cozy. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with 100 different smells. Books were piled everywhere, on shelves, on chairs, on the floor. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over everything. A large black cat was asleep on a rug by the fire, and it opened one lazy eye to look at them before going back to sleep. The witch led him to a sturdy wooden chair and handed him a steaming mug of tea. It was sweet and warm, and chased some of the cold from his bones. She moved about the room, stoking the fire, cutting a thick slice of dark bread and spreading it with honey for him. She did not ask him questions. She did not press him for his story. She simply created a space of quiet warmth, a sanctuary from the world outside. Thomas watched her, confused. This was not the child-eating monster from the tales. This was a woman who made tea and kept a sleepy cat. He ate the bread and drank the tea, and for the first time that night, the tight knot of fear in his stomach began to loosen, just a little. After Thomas had finished his bread and tea, the witch finally sat down opposite him. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing lines of age and thought around her eyes. "The men of your village," she began, her voice low and even. "They believe I have power. They are right." Thomas flinched, gripping his empty mug tightly. He expected her to cackle, to reveal her terrible secrets, but she just watched him with her moss-green eyes, a hint of sadness in them. "They think power is a weapon, a thing to be used to hurt, to control, to frighten. They see my power and they are afraid." She leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "Power, little one, is not good or evil. It is like a river. A river can be a destructive force, flooding villages and washing away homes. Or it can be a gentle thing, watering the fields so that crops can grow. It can carve a canyon out of stone over 1,000 years, or it can simply provide a cool drink to a thirsty animal. The river does not choose. The power is just there. It is the intention behind it that matters. The choice of how to use it." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The village elders," she continued, "they use fear. Fear is a kind of power. They use their fear of me, of the unknown, to make you all follow their traditions without question. They tell you that a painful ritual will protect you from my dark magic. But what they are really doing is using their power to hurt you, to mark you, because they are afraid. They believe that causing a small, controlled pain will protect them from a larger, unknown one. It is a choice born not of wisdom, but of terror." This made a strange kind of sense to Thomas. It was not about him being brave, it was about them being scared. "I have power, yes," the witch said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I can help herbs grow strong. I can read the signs in the wind and the stars. I can soothe a fever or mend a broken bone. And I can listen to the heart of a frightened boy who has run into the woods to escape a needless pain. Power can be used to care, to heal, to understand. That is the choice I have made. The men of your village have made a different one. Now, you must learn to make your own." Her words were a revelation, opening a door in his mind that he never knew existed. Back in the village, the sun was rising, casting its pale light on a scene of growing panic. Thomas's father, a broad-shouldered man named John, had woken to find his son's bed empty. A cold dread, far worse than the anxiety he'd felt about the ceremony, gripped him. He called his son's name, his voice growing louder and more frantic with each unanswered shout. He searched the house, the yard, the woodshed. Nothing. The boy was gone. The neatly folded clothes for the ceremony lay untouched on a chair, a silent accusation. John's heart hammered against his ribs. The tradition suddenly seemed like a foolish, terrible thing in the face of his missing child. Soon, the entire village was awake and buzzing with the news. Neighbors poured out of their homes, their faces etched with concern. The village elder emerged from his hut, the sharpened knife now seeming like a cruel and useless object. John, his face pale and strained, confessed his last conversation with his son. He had told him to be a man, to be brave, to not cry. He had dismissed his son's fear as childish nonsense. Now the memory of his son's wide, terrified eyes haunted him. He had been so focused on upholding tradition that he had failed to see the boy, his own son, who was trembling with fear. The men formed a search party. "He must have run into the forest," someone said, and a collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned towards the dark line of trees, towards the crooked cottage just visible through the morning mist. The fear of the witch, which had been a useful story just hours before, now became a horrifying reality. The whispers turned venomous. "She has him," a woman cried. "She's taken him for one of her spells." The fear they had cultivated for generations now turned on them, twisting their concern into a dangerous, angry mob mentality. John, however, felt a different kind of fear. It was not of the witch, but for his son. He had driven his boy away, right into the arms of the thing they all dreaded. The guilt was a heavy weight in his gut. He pushed through the angry murmurs of the crowd. "We will find him," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. He looked at the faces of the other men who had put their own sons through the same ritual. He saw their bravado waver, replaced by a flicker of doubt, a shared, unspoken question. What had they been doing, and why? He grabbed a lantern even though it was daylight, and led the way towards the woods. The search party moved cautiously through the woods, a clumsy, noisy group of men ill-suited to the quiet of the forest. They shouted Thomas's name, their calls echoing unanswered through the trees. As they drew closer to the witch's cottage, their steps slowed, their bravado replaced by a primal fear. They clutched their farming tools like weapons, pitchforks and sickles looking ridiculous and out of place. John was at the front, his fatherly desperation overriding his fear. He was ready to fight a monster, to wrestle a demon, to do whatever it took to get his son back. Just as they reached the clearing where the crooked house stood, the door opened. The witch emerged, standing calmly on her doorstep. Behind her, peeking out from behind her dark cloak, was Thomas. He was not crying or hurt. He looked calm, his eyes clear. He was holding a half-eaten apple in his hand. A stunned silence fell over the men. They stared, confused, at the scene before them. This was not the dramatic rescue they had imagined. There was no struggle, no sign of dark magic, only a boy who looked perfectly safe. John let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his knees feeling weak with relief. "He was lost," the witch said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "He was frightened, not of me, but of you." She looked directly at John, her moss-green eyes unblinking. "You were going to hurt him, to prove he was a man. You filled his head with stories of my evil to justify your own cruelty. But fear is a poor teacher, and pain is a poor price for manhood." Her words were not angry or accusatory. They were simple statements of fact, and they struck the men harder than any physical blow. They looked at each other, at their hands gripping their tools, and a deep shame settled over them. Thomas stepped forward, away from the witch's protection. He looked at his father. "I was scared," he said, his voice small but steady. "I didn't want to be cut." John dropped the lantern he was holding. It clattered on the ground. He rushed forward and knelt before his son, pulling him into a fierce hug. He didn't say anything about being brave or being a man. He just held his child, rocking him back and forth, muttering, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The other villagers watched, silent and humbled. The monster they had come to fight was not in the cottage. It had been in their own traditions, in their own unquestioning minds. The walk back to the village was quiet. It was not the fearful, suspicious silence that usually fell when the witch was near. It was a thoughtful silence, heavy with new understanding. The witch walked with them, not as a prisoner, but as a neighbor. Thomas walked beside his father, his hand held securely in John's. No one looked at the witch with hatred anymore. They looked at her with a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning respect. She had not stolen their child. She had cared for him. She had not used dark powers against them. She had used wisdom. When they reached the village square, the elder was waiting, his face a mask of grim authority. He saw the witch, and his hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt, but John stepped in front of him. "No," he said, his voice firm. "There will be no cutting today. We need to talk." This was a revolutionary act. No one had ever questioned the elder before. A murmur went through the assembled crowd, but it was a murmur of agreement, not protest. The fear that had held the tradition in place for so long had been broken. It had been replaced by the simple, powerful truth of a father's love for his son. That day, the villagers talked. They truly talked, for the first time in generations. They talked about fear and why they clung to painful traditions. They listened to the witch, who spoke not of magic, but of choice and kindness. She explained that power could be used to heal as easily as it could be used to harm. They listened to Thomas, who spoke of his fear in a way that made the other men remember their own. They started to see that true strength was not in enduring pain without question, but in having the courage to ask why the pain was necessary at all. From that day forward, the village began to change. The old, fearful silence was replaced by conversation. The tradition of circumcision was not abandoned overnight, but it was no longer a mandatory, terrifying ordeal. It became a choice, discussed openly between fathers and sons, with understanding and compassion. The witch was no longer a monster at the edge of the woods. She became a wise woman, a healer, a respected member of their community. The villagers learned that the greatest power of all was not magic, nor was it tradition. It was the power to listen, to understand, and to choose kindness over fear.